What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be continuing on my series of reviews on the Alien franchise with the third installment that came out in 1992, simply titled Alien 3. This time around directed by David Fincher, Alien 3 once again stars Sigourney Weaver as the character of Ripley, as well as people like Charles Dance, Charles S. Dutton, Ralph Brown, and more. So if you guys saw my recent reviews for Alien and Aliens, with of course Aliens being the most recent review, I think it was only 2 videos ago that I just did it, you guys know I love those films. The first one's a horror film focusing on one alien, and the sequel, Aliens, has many aliens in the mix and is more of an action film, and I really praised the fuck out of the two of them, let's be completely and utterly honest, especially the last one, Aliens, and I spent so much of that last video praising in particular the practical effects of the time that still hold up till this day. I love what both Ridley Scott and James Cameron did with the franchise with their own individual installments, continuing on the story of Ripley. Now, I made a joke at the very end of the last video though, saying that I hope that the sequel wouldn't go ahead and ruin such a great ending in Aliens immediately right at the start of the next film. And that's exactly what happens here with Alien 3, as at the very beginning of this film, we find out that Ripley has been floating through space and ends up crash landing into the ocean of this planet right next to a prison that is homed by a bunch of individuals who are prisoners, a bunch of men who of course are all rapists and murderers and different things like that, but have found God. A bunch of overly religious individuals who have very dark past, who have not seen a woman in a very, very long time. And so here comes crash landing this ship. They get in there, they find there's a woman on board who survived, but what happened to the rest of the characters? Michael Bihn's character, you had Bishop on there as well as the character of Newt, the young girl from the last film, everybody who got away safely at the end of Aliens. They're all fucking dead. Immediately we learn as they crash land on this planet that Sigourney Weaver's character is the only surviving member. It turns out that there was a face hugger on board this craft that they were on that we thought that they got away safely on, and due to that, as well as some other things going wrong with the ship, everybody on board died except for Ripley. And this is just, I just don't get why movies do this. We don't see it as commonly today, but there's still plenty of movies that come out from time to time that will instantly undo the ending of the previous film, and I just have never understood that from a writing perspective. The director of this film is David Fincher, who would go on to direct some of the most iconic films and become one of the biggest names in directing in general when it comes to cinema. So he is somebody I have a lot of respect for. I have reviewed films of his here on the channel before and given him tons of praise. But yeah, this was not a strong one here for David Fincher. What I will say is that this film moves away from the action element of the last film and more into the horror element, but doesn't necessarily have that slower paced horror that you see in the first film, and instead feels more like a slasher, with the xenomorph going back to being just one xenomorph specifically that we're focusing on, and the xenomorph being more of just a killing machine. And of course they killed people in all the other ones as well, but the first one felt like a slower paced horror film where it was the creep factor. Where is this alien? What is this creature? In the sequel, you know what it is, and so they're like, all right, you know what these things are, let's have a bunch of them, let's have them take them out with a bunch of guns and weaponry. Then in this one they're like, let's take it back to basics, but let's take a note out of the various other slasher films that had come out throughout the course of the 80s, with us having an onslaught of characters that you do not care about at all, characters you won't know their names, you'll recognize their face slightly throughout the course of the film, and ultimately you're just watching them all get picked off one at a time until a very small group of them are still focused on near the end of the film as they try to fight off this xenomorph. And we're going to get into more of the details on this movie, but right out of the gate, the biggest disappointment is that, yeah, they essentially throw away the ending of the last film immediately, and that's just terrible. I hate that element of the film right out of the gate. It's such a letdown. If you are binging these movies or watching them close together like I have been as I'm doing this series of reviews, what a letdown to see the ending of such a fantastic film, Aliens, something that was one of the most iconic films of its time and would go on to just continually push forward the xenomorph as one of the greatest movie monsters of all time, and gave us the Alien Queen, which was one of the most iconic sequences of the 80s, only for us to get into the next film several years later and just have it all thrown away. You know, the characters you're rooting for, the characters you're happy to see saved, the characters that Ripley is fighting for throughout the course of the film, completely decimated. So Yeah, that's a big bummer at the very start of this movie for sure, without a doubt. What I can say is that I still love Ripley in these movies. I think that Sigourney Weaver is just great in the role, and while I don't necessarily like what they did on a writing level, I think that her performance in terms of acting off of the fact that these characters that she thought she had escaped with have now died is pretty solid. This is of course also the film where Ripley shaves her head, so you got a lot of those iconic shots here in this film. There are some elements of this film that I do think are iconic Alien moments that I think when people think of the Alien franchise overall, there are moments in this film that do come to mind, and I think a lot of that has to do with Sigourney Weaver. Of course, it does kind of go back to basics though, and there is a bit of a redundancy because Sigourney now has to re-explain what the xenomorph is to a new group of individuals who have no idea what this creature is, what she's been through, so they kind of think she's crazy again. And of course, like we've seen in the last two movies, the alien starts to appear, starts to kill people, people start to see it, and then there's that classic, oh my god, this is what you were talking about, we should have believed you kind of moment. And yeah, so there is a bit of that redundancy from what we've already seen in the last two films. And it made sense for the first film, of course. It made even more sense for the second film because it's the first time she's going to a new group of people and telling them about it. But to be in the third film and have to do that again with a new group of people again is just a bit of a just redundant element that just makes you go like, okay, let's get to the nitty gritty here. And just what a strange concept, honestly, to have Ripley land on this planet or this area that has, you know, this prison on it that has all these men who are overly religious that are now struggling and are tempted because there's a woman there, and they really highlight the fact that they're all rapists and murderers and they all have this really dark past, but they're all incredibly religious and they have found God, and they are struggling now with the fact that there's a woman around. Like, the fact that that was the premise they came up with for this movie is just strange to me. I watched it with my fiance who had never seen this movie before, and so she was highlighting the same fact. She just thought it was such a strange area and place to kind of set this movie in. But I guess it kind of made it easy to have an onslaught of characters, as I mentioned before, that are really just there to be killed off by the xenomorph. Now, I mentioned before in the last two videos that the xenomorph is one of my favorite movie monsters of all time, and one of the greatest elements about these films is the practical effects used to bring the xenomorph to life. And when you look at the first film, it's great. When you look at the sequel, it's even better, especially with the queen element at the very end. And when you look at this film, when the practical elements of the xenomorph work and that's at the forefront, I think that's when the film's at its best. Some of the greatest moments of this film are with the xenomorph that are practical. It looks incredible, and there are elements where you can see that the practical effect makeup and work had exceeded and had kind of moved forward since the events of even Aliens. However, there are more scenes than not in this film where the alien is digital. I think that really takes away from a lot of what makes this franchise as good as it is. Now, there are films later in the franchise, most notably Prometheus and Alien Covenant, that utilize a lot of CGI and digital work, of course, to bring these xenomorphs to life. And I think, for the most part, because we are way further in the world of CGI, those xenomorphs look great in a lot of ways, and we'll get to those films when we get to those films. But in the case of this film, you can tell we were still in the early days of digital effects really being utilized in films, and so when you have that practical xenomorph in those moments in this film, it looks amazing. And most notably, one of the most iconic shots in this film, or where the xenomorph comes up and essentially sniffs Ripley's face and gets real close up. There's a great shot, iconic shot of her being terrified with it being right by her face. It's one of my favorite shots in the entirety of the Alien franchise. And so yeah, when you have the practical element, it looks great, but those digital elements of this film just make it look so fake at times when it's running on the walls and things like that, that it takes away from what made the franchise as good as it was when it comes down to practical effects. And a key thing about this film is that we end up learning that Ripley actually has a xenomorph within her. So not only is there a xenomorph around, she was also attached by a face hugger while she was in cryostasis or while she was in hypersleep. And now she's discovered that there is one inside of her. And so she must now try to figure out a way to help kill this xenomorph as well as kill herself. She's ready to sacrifice herself. She's like, we need to get this out of me. We need to kill me. And that's the only way we're going to be able to really survive. We cannot let the company and others and get their hands on this. We can't let this creature continue to go out there. So her and a small group of the remaining prisoners here end up working together to try to kill the xenomorph and use her kind of like a shield, because we learned pretty pretty quickly that the reason that xenomorph came up and essentially kind of gave her a sniff was because he recognized that there was a xenomorph inside of her. So anytime she's around, the xenomorph kind of backs away because it doesn't want to kill her, because it knows that she is carrying another one of his brethren. And so I thought that was an interesting element of the film. That is something I like. This unfortunately does lead to the death of Ripley at the end of the film, though, as she sacrifices herself, throwing herself into a big, furnace, essentially. I am gonna leave it for the video for the fourth one to talk to you guys about what they did with Sigourney Weaver in that film, because I think from this point on, the height of the franchise had kind of taken a dip. This film is suitable enough. It is serviceable. I think it's an enjoyable film for what it is. It's more of a slasher. I think there's some cool camera work in this film, some cool moments of action, some pretty gory kills that I can enjoy overall. But when it comes down to, really telling a good character developing story, I think that this is the film where they really did Ripley dirty, just based on the events of the last film and how they kind of instantly undo that and ultimately killing her off in this film. I think they do good things with her in some areas. I think that Sigourney Weaver gives a lot to the performance, but I ultimately think that they didn't do enough for it to ever really feel satisfying. This movie came to an end and I was kind of like, all right, that's fine, I guess. That's Alien 3, and as a kid, I enjoyed this movie a little bit more, but I hadn't seen this movie in quite some time. The first two are the ones I revisited the most. I remember that this took place in a prison. I remember that the whole religious element with the people. I remember that Ripley does die in this film, but rewatching it after having just seen Aliens not long ago, it was that thing that kind of made me scratch my head and made me wonder, why was this the path that they chose to go on? I don't think this is a terrible movie like some might say, but I do think it's a big step down in comparison to the first two, and doesn't really have much on a character level that really ever gets you super excited to see where things are going to go, or ever be fully attached to any of the characters. Whereas I think that while there are some random characters you don't care about in the previous two, they do a better job of at least getting a few that you can kind of rally behind. And while there's maybe a couple here, it's really not enough when it comes down to character development to ever really get you rooting for these characters. And with that, let's talk about some of the actors and some of the key characters in here that I think are worth mentioning. Like I said, there's a bunch of them, but a lot of them are just there to be fodder for the Alien. But the main ones to really talk about, you have Charles Dance in here that plays Dr. Jonathan Clements, one of the prisoners who actually builds a bit of a romantic interest with Sigourney Weaver's character, Ripley. He's fine in the film. He's kind of there a lot of times for exposition, to kind of be the clever mind in a lot of ways, the doctor who's able to kind of give her some information, the one who's able to kind of help her discover that she does have a xenomorph within her, and she kind of gives Ripley this ability to kind of connect with somebody. It does feel rather abrupt. I don't necessarily love the romantic element of this film, but I've always enjoyed Charles Dance, and I think he gives a pretty solid performance here, even if his character isn't really overly fleshed out. My favorite character in the mix is actually played by Charles S. Dutton, and that's the character of Leonard Dillon, who is probably the most religious out of this bunch, and he makes it very clear that he too was a rapist and a murderer, but he's probably the one who is the most convicted to his faith, and he's the one that mainly is trying to keep everybody else in line, tries to take control of the situation, is kind of like a leader in a lot of ways. He's not the leader, but he kind of takes on a leadership role, especially as things start to get a lot crazier later on, and starts to be kind of like one of the main ones working alongside Ripley to take on the xenomorph later on in the film. And for the most part, I think his performance is both funny at times as well as really compelling, and I found him to be one of the more interesting characters in the ginormous mix of random characters that you have in the mix. Then you have Ralph Brown in the mix playing the character of Francis, who is one of the individuals who actually works for the company. He's kind of an overseer at this prison. He's not actually a prisoner, but he is kind of stuck here with these prisoners, so he kind of works alongside them as if he is one of them. I'll always remember him, though, as the character of Rick O'Lee from The Phantom Menace, who is in there the brief portion in the earlier part of the film. He'll always be that character to me in my mind. So as I was watching this film, I just kept hearing his lines from The Phantom Menace play in my head over and over again. And then the last most notable thing to mention in this film is that at the very end of the film, of course, the company has learned that there's a xenomorph at this prison. They come there and they send a familiar face, somebody that the credits actually credit as Bishop 2, but it's Lance Henriksen once again, but he's saying that he's not Bishop this time. He's saying he's not an android, that he is the person that they based the android on. And so he shows up and tries to get Ripley to come with them, to come to safety, and promises that nothing is going to happen with that xenomorph that's within her. They're going to try to save her, that they're going to kill the xenomorph within her, and that they're just here to help her. She doesn't believe this new bishop in any way, shape, or form, so this is where she decides to sacrifice herself. But it was nice to see Lance Henriksen in this film, even if it's wildly brief. I mentioned in the last video that Lance Henriksen would appear over the course of multiple films in this franchise as various characters, so we will see him again, and I'll bring him up when we get to that point. But overall, that's my thoughts on Alien 3. I think it's a film that does have some solid practical effect work, some great cinematography, some solid musical score elements as well, and for the most part, solid performances. I also like the costume design and the overall look of the film, though it is a little bit overly red, and there are some weird camera choices that are a little bit wonky that I think were meant to be stylistic but come off a little bit cheesy in this day and age. I think when it comes down to the practical effects around the xenomorph, I can't praise it as much as the previous films because you don't see the xenomorph as much, and when he is practical, he looks fucking incredible, but when it's not practical and it's digital, it does take away from those elements that make the film so awesome. But there are some gory kills in here that I really enjoy, and as a huge fan of cheesy slashers from the 80s, I can appreciate this film kind of taking a note or a page from those books and kind of making this more of a slasher film. But I do think when it comes down to what made those first two Alien films awesome with character and practical effects and tension, this film just kind of lacks that. It's an enjoyable enough watch. I think it's serviceable, but it totally makes sense that this is usually near the bottom of people's ranking when it comes to the Alien franchise. So with all that said, I'm looking forward to talking about Alien 4, and then we will move on to the two prequel films as we make our way through the Alien franchise ahead of Alien Romulus later this year. I'm going to try to push on and also get through some of the Predator films and do Alien vs. Predator. I don't know if I'll get all of those done by the time I get to Alien Romulus, but even if I end up doing my review for Alien Romulus, I'll continue on and get the rest of those videos out for you guys. It's been a lot of fun going back and revisiting these films thus far, even if this one, it was one I don't love nearly as much as the first two, but there is some nostalgia there that is at least able to allow me to enjoy this film and revisiting it after all these years. So I look forward to hearing from all of you guys. What is your favorite film in the Alien franchise? How do you guys feel about Alien 3? Do you guys like this film? Do you not like this film? Do you feel like me and think it completely ruins the last film in a lot of ways? Or do you actually enjoy this film a lot more than people say? Definitely looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.